The living room went silent the second the briefcase hit the marble, clack, echo, freeze, and Daniel Cole, the man everyone in the city called the coldest deal-maker, stared like he had seen a ghost. His 18-month-old twins, Max and Eli, the boys doctors said might not walk for a long time and might not talk at all, were not only on their feet. They were wobbling across the thick rug, faces open like sunrise, voices small but bright as they reached their hands toward the woman kneeling by the couch. "Mama, up." Max said, the word thin but real like a light switch clicking on in a dark room. "Up." Eli echoed, clinging to her sleeve. And the woman, Nina Parker, 26, brown-skinned, hair in a neat low puff, eyes steady like the calm part of the ocean, lifted her head and met Daniel's stare. She had taken them outside earlier. He had told her not to. He had said, no parks, no steps, no risk. He had said everything was fragile. He had said the house was safer. He had said he was in charge. But this was the moment you clicked for, the impossible first step that changes every rule, and now I have to ask you before we go on, would you trust love over fear if you saw proof right in front of you? Tap like if your answer is yes, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I can greet you by name. This one is for every parent, every guardian, every child who ever needed someone to just show up and stay. Now breathe with me because what happens next will test every heart in this house, and the last line of this chapter will drop you off a cliff you won't expect. 3 months earlier, the Cole mansion felt like a museum that forgot people live inside it. Everything was clean, sharp, and quiet. No crayons anywhere. No baby books left open by a lamp. No tiny socks hanging off a chair. Just glass, steel, and a schedule printed by an assistant who never smiled. Daniel ran his empire like a clock. He tried to run grief that way too. His wife, Lauren, had died the day the boys were born. Everyone said it like a soft fact. Complications. It was a hard word wearing a nice shirt. Daniel showed up to the funeral in a black suit that did not wrinkle even when he cried in the back room where no one could see. After that day, he told himself feelings were like meetings, 15 minutes max, then move on. The twins' nursery had every gadget, every therapy brochure, every expert number pinned to a board. But the boys didn't care about boards. They lay on their backs and watched the ceiling fan. They made little sounds sometimes, not words, not even babble, just air. Their legs were soft as bread. When a physical therapist moved Max's feet, he cried like the sound came from far away. When a speech lady waved a puppet at Eli, he turned his head to the wall and slept. People said trauma. People said delays. People said give it time. Daniel said fix it. He hired 5 nannies in 4 months. 1 left because she felt invisible. 1 left because the house felt like a hospital. 1 left because the rules were a cage. 2 were fired because Daniel thought they were too soft. He didn't want soft. He wanted results. Nina came on a rainy Thursday with a plain resume, a cheap umbrella, and a look on her face that said she didn't scare easy. She had grown up in a small apartment with a grandma who taught her that babies listen with their skin before they listen with their ears. She had helped care for cousins who didn't talk for a long time after a bad fire. She had taken night classes on child development and read about attachment while riding the bus. She didn't have rich references. She had real ones. A church nursery leader wrote, "This girl sits on the floor until a crying child stops shaking." A mom from a shelter wrote, "She did not give up on my son even when he pushed her away." When Daniel asked, "What makes you different?" Nina said, "I won't do battle with the boys. I'll do battle with the silence." Daniel almost didn't hire her. She was not impressed by his watch. She didn't flinch when he listed rules. She asked one question that made him look down at his shoes. "Mr. Cole, where do the boys see your face at their level each day?" He didn't have an answer. He said, "You start Monday." The first morning Nina moved a chair to the floor. She rolled up a plush blanket like a hill. She warmed the room by opening the curtains and letting sunlight make squares on the carpet. She didn't bring flashcards. She brought a simple song about names. Max Max clap clap. Eli Eli tap tap. She sang it low like a hum that could carry a small boat. The twins stared. She didn't rush. She matched her breathing to theirs the way a swimmer finds the tide. When Max kicked by accident, she whispered, "That's it." When Eli turned his head an inch toward her voice, she smiled with her whole face so he could feel it even if he wouldn't look. She put one of Daniel's shirts beside them, clean but smelling faintly like him, and said, "Daddy is near even when he is busy." She set a metronome of love in that room, slow, steady, no hurry. On day 3 she placed both boys belly down on the blanket hill for 1 minute, then 2. They fussed. She rubbed circles on their backs. "I hear you. I'm here." On day 5 she wore a soft bracelet with tiny bells so the sound would follow her hands when she reached. Eli's eyes tracked the jingle. On day 6 she put both boys in slings on her chest and walked the hallway heart to heart, step by step, whispering, up, down, left, right, like a spell you say to remind the body it belongs to itself. Daniel watched on a screen in his office between calls. He told himself it was for safety, but he knew the truth. He was afraid to be in the room and see nothing change. The cameras showed slow things that didn't look like progress if you wanted miracles by noon. Nina laughing when nothing was funny just to call life into the air. Nina letting Max hold her thumb for 8 minutes straight while she pretended that was the only job she had. Nina pressing her forehead to Eli's for 2 long breaths, then 3, then 4, until his shoulders dropped a tiny bit. The CEO who ate numbers for breakfast could not measure this. One night he scrolled back and watched for 2 hours and realized he had never seen anyone look at his sons this long without asking them to do something. He closed the window. He opened a spreadsheet. He didn't cry. Not then. The rule was no outside. It came from fear dressed up as logic. Doctors worried about falls. Daniel worried about the world. He had lost one person he loved. He would not lose 2 more. The yard was big, the stairs were wide, the news loved rich people's pain, and he had a board meeting every Monday. So he said, no outside, as if the sky itself could be a thief. But Nina kept seeing how the boy's eyes followed brightness. She kept seeing how Max's fingers opened when wind brushed the drapes. She kept seeing how Eli made a tiny sound when a bird sang in the morning. She asked once, could we try 5 minutes in the garden? Daniel said no, then wrote a new policy and sent it through the house app like he was sending a law. Nina didn't argue with the app. She argued with the silence. On the day it happened, the mansion was extra quiet. The staff walked soft, because high-risk investors were coming at noon, and Daniel wanted perfection like a shield. Nina fed the boys oatmeal and let them smear a little on her knuckles so they could feel sticky and warm and safe. She lined up 3 toy blocks by the door and said, red, blue, yellow, like colors were friends who keep showing up even when you hide from them. Around 10, a slant of sun moved across the rug and made a path straight to the glass. Nina saw it like a sign. She lifted Max to her hip. She took Eli's hands around her thumb. She looked at the camera in the corner and said softly, we'll be right here. Just air. Just light. Then she opened the door and stepped onto the patio where the world smelled like wet earth and cut grass and something like possibility. At first nothing big happened. The twins squinted. The wind touched their cheeks and their mouths made little O shapes. A sparrow hopped near the railing and then away. Nina sat on a picnic blanket and set both boys on their bellies like tiny explorers. She put her palm on their backs so they knew she wouldn't leave. We are safe, she said, not loud, not quiet, just true. She pointed to the tree shadow and then to the light. Dark, she said. Light. She tapped the wood deck. Up. She patted the blanket. Down. She gave the world simple names, the way you give a new friend your nickname first. Max pushed once with his right leg and slid an inch. Eli grunted and tucked one knee under, then flopped. Nina laughed like he told the best joke. That's it, buddy. Your body remembers. She took off her shoes and let the boards feel her skin. Babies learn faster when the person who holds them relaxes. She relaxed. She hummed. She didn't rush. The door clicked behind her. Nina didn't hear it because the wind carried the smell of lavender from the garden, and Max had just tried again. But Daniel heard everything, the hum, the air, the sound of his rule breaking, and he felt heat rise behind his collar. He had told her no. He had warned her. He had a meeting in an hour. He had a list of risks in his head like a scrolling stock ticker. Slips, germs, headlines, judgment. And under all of that, like a bass note he refused to name, he had fear. He walked to the patio with steps that were not loud but were not kind. Miss Parker, he said, his voice flat as glass. Inside. Now. Nina looked up. She didn't scramble. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She said, we're safer than we look. He said, that was not the question. He pointed toward the living room. We go in when I say we go in. His words lined up like soldiers. The twins felt the air change. Their fingers curled. Max made a small sound like a door hinge. Eli turned his face to Nina's knee. She put a hand on each small back. You're okay, she whispered, and then to Daniel, please watch for 10 seconds before you decide. He opened his mouth to say no. Then he closed it. 10 seconds wasn't long. He could give the appearance of listening. He folded his arms like a shield and counted in his head, 1, 2, 3. On 4, Max pulled his knee under and pushed. On 5, Eli rocked forward like a boat catching a wave. On 6, both boys slid, then paused, then slid again, the small muscles around their mouths tight with work. On 7, Nina pulled her hands an inch away so they could feel their own power and know she would still catch them if they fell. On 8, Max made a sound that was not a cry and not a cough, something new, like an engine turning over for the first time. On 9, Eli pressed both palms, lifted, and you could see in his eyes that he had just discovered up. On 10, Daniel forgot the count because both boys, both of them, pushed to hands and knees at the same time, and the world held its breath. Up, Nina whispered, the word simple as bread. Max shifted his weight and tucked one foot under. Eli copied without looking to see if it was right. They wobbled. The blanket gave them mercy. Nina moved her palm to hover beside their ribs. You are safe, she said again like a drumbeat. One more rock. One more push. They rose. Not all the way. Not yet. But the shape of standing was there, the idea of it, the yes. Daniel felt something split behind his ribs. He did not blink. If he blinked, this might be a dream that would be gone when he opened his eyes. Nina kept her voice like warm tea. Up. Max's legs trembled. Eli's toes dug into the blanket. They both straightened, half bent, then more, until tiny knees locked for a heartbeat, then two. Their mouths opened. A bird called. Somewhere a truck passed on the road. Time stretched like taffy. And then, as if the word had been waiting in the walls, Max said, Ma. An old grief moved in the air like a ghost. Dan's throat closed. Nina didn't let the moment slide away. She pressed a hand to her chest and smiled so wide they could feel it. Nina, she said gently. Nana. She pointed to herself. Nina. She pointed to Daniel at the door. Didi. She did not say mama. She would not steal that word. She would teach them to place words where they belong. Eli tried to shape a sound and made nah. It was not the same. It was enough. She clapped once, soft so it wouldn't startle, and both boys laughed like sunlight. Daniel stepped closer because his legs moved without asking him. Up close, progress looked different than it did on a report. Max's cheeks were pink from effort. Eli's little fists opened and closed like they were saying hello to the air. Nina kept one hand close but not touching, like a promise and a challenge at the same time. Mr. Cole, she said, eyes never leaving the boys, they need your face in their sky. He almost said he had a meeting. He almost said the risk memo said falls lead to setbacks. He almost said 1,000 safe things that had kept his heart from breaking since the day the hospital called him sir, when they took Lauren away. But the boys were standing. The boys were making sounds that wanted to be words. Some rules don't survive the truth. He knelt. It was stiff and not graceful, and his knee hit the wood and the noise made Max flinch, but he stayed. Hey, he said, voice rough like he hadn't used it for this in a long time. I'm here. Nina nodded like a coach who had just watched the play finally work. She didn't say, good job. She didn't need to. She took one slow breath and let the boys hear it, then took another so they could copy. They did. Their shoulders softened. Eli leaned toward Daniel like a compass finding north. Inside the house, the staff moved quietly because they could feel when something holy was happening in a room even if they didn't know why. The assistant checked her watch and then didn't dare open the patio door. The cook stood in the hallway and prayed a small prayer she had learned from her mother in another country. The head of security watched the screen and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and told the guard beside him not to talk about it. Money can buy cameras. It cannot buy this kind of hush. For the next 10 minutes, the world shrank to a triangle. Daniel's eyes, Nina's breath, the twins' small knees. Max fell forward into Nina's hands and didn't cry because she turned the fall into a game and said, safe. Eli swayed and touched Daniel's tie, fingers curious. Daniel took the tie off and tucked it in his pocket like it had been a bad idea all along. We can do this again, Nina said to the boys and to Daniel both. Tomorrow. And the day after that. Little steps. Little words. But every day your face at their level, your voice like home. Daniel nodded once because his mouth couldn't find the right shape. Then he found it. Thank you, he said, and he meant more than those 2 words could carry. He meant I'm sorry I made fear into law. He meant I don't know how to be both boss and father, but I want to learn. He meant I hear you. I see you. I see them. If the story stayed gentle here, we could rest. But life is not a straight line, and love is not a movie where the credits roll after one miracle. 10 minutes can change a house. 10 seconds can shake it again. The patio door, the same one that had opened to let hope in, slid wider with a hard scrape. A voice cut the warm air like a blade. What is going on here? It was not a question built to learn. It was built to accuse. 2 board members had arrived early, big donors to a new project. Men who saw children like branding if you weren't careful. Behind them stood a woman in a tight suit, Daniel's operations chief, who liked rules the way a locksmith likes locks. She held a tablet with the policy letter glowing on it, and no outside activity without approval. "Mr. Cole," she said sharply, "this is a clear violation of the care protocol. If the boys are injured before the noon presentation, the liability—" She didn't finish because Eli, startled by the sharp tone, wobbled. Nina moved like wind, soft and fast, catching him with one hand and pressing him to her chest so he could hear a safe heartbeat and remember where calm lives. Max made that hinge sound again, not a cry, a warning. Daniel stood, slow at first, then not slow. "Enough," he said, and the word was quiet but heavy. He looked at the bored men, at the tablet, at the space where fear had lived like a king in his house. "You're early," he told them, "and you're on my patio." One man cleared his throat, eyes on the twins like he had found a weak spot in the story he wanted to tell in the meeting. "We were hoping to review the deck," he said. Daniel didn't blink. "You're looking at it," he replied. "This is the only deck that matters." The operations chief's mouth tightened. "We need to return inside. Now." She flicked a glance at Nina like she was a problem to solve. Nina didn't flinch. She shifted Eli to her hip and held out 2 fingers to Max so he could practice weight shifting while holding on. "We're okay," she told the boys. Then to Daniel, "They can handle voices if your face stays soft." He understood. He crouched again so the twins could see his eyes. "You're safe," he told them. He didn't look at the tablet. He didn't look at the men. He kept the triangle steady, father, helper, children, like a small tent in a gust. But wind finds seams. One board member took a step closer and snapped a photo before anyone could stop him. The sound of the shutter was too quick, too hard. Max startled. His knee buckled. The blanket bunched. Eli reached for the phone like a warning beacon. Nina moved again, steady hands, soft voice, but this time the edge of the blanket slid and Max tipped toward the wood deck where a sharp screw head stuck up the tiniest bit, a flaw a contractor missed, a flaw no one had noticed until this exact second when everything slowed down and choices mattered more than rules ever had. Nina lunged. Daniel lunged. The photo man lifted his hands like, "Not my fault." The operations chief took a step back as if the air itself might blame her. And as Max's small forehead lined up with that tiny cruel screw, a scream, high, raw, protective, tore the quiet in two. It came from someone none of them expected to be in the doorway at all. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Max's tiny legs shaking as they tried to hold him upright, Eli's mouth forming that first sound, and Nina's calm voice cutting through the chaos like a hymn. He paced the mansion, bare feet sinking into the soft carpet, the silence now heavy with memory instead of emptiness. The walls had always been perfect, white, cold, expensive, but tonight they looked alive, touched by something human. He stopped outside the nursery door. Light spilled under the crack. Nina hadn't gone to bed yet. Inside, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the crib, humming softly. Both twins were asleep, Max's small hand clutching her index finger through the bars. Daniel leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her without speaking. There was something disarming about the way she belonged there, not like an employee, not like a guest, but like a heartbeat that had been missing all along. "You should rest," he said finally, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Nina looked up, her eyes soft but steady. "I'll rest when they're settled. They move a lot in their sleep now, means their muscles are waking up." "That's good." She smiled faintly. "Bodies remember before the mind does." Daniel walked further into the room, his suit jacket gone, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. "You broke a rule today," he said, but the edge was gone from his voice. "I know," she said simply. "But sometimes rules keep pain alive longer than it needs to." He stared at her for a long moment, then at the boys. "I spent so much on specialists. Months of therapy. Nothing. And then you?" His voice cracked, disbelief tangled with wonder. "How did you do it?" Nina brushed a curl from her forehead. "It's not magic. They didn't need more experts. They needed connection. Babies don't learn safety from instructions. They learn it from someone who doesn't leave when they cry." She turned her gaze to him, quiet but firm. "You've been protecting them from the world, Mr. Cole. But you also protected them from you." The words hit harder than she probably meant them to. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I was doing my best," he said. "I know," she replied gently. "But your best came from fear, not love." He looked away, the air thick with the truth of it. For the first time in months he felt smaller, not because he'd failed but because he'd finally been seen. The next morning the mansion buzzed with confusion. The photo taken on the patio had somehow found its way to a social media page linked to one of the board members. The caption read, "Billionaire's forbidden nanny experiment, risking disabled twins for a miracle story?" It spread faster than wildfire. Daniel's phone lit up with calls from investors and publicists. His assistant hovered outside the kitchen, too scared to enter. When Daniel walked in, Nina was already there feeding the twins oatmeal. The air smelled of cinnamon and baby lotion. Max banged his spoon against the tray, laughing. Eli tried to copy him. They were alive in a way that made the noise feel like joy. "You've seen it?" she asked quietly, not looking up. "Yes," he said. "Half the world probably has by now." She sighed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for that to happen." He shook his head. "It's not your fault. They took something sacred and made it spectacle." He leaned against the counter, watching her spoon feed Eli. But maybe this is the first time people see them as real children instead of a headline about tragedy. Nina smiled faintly. Real children don't need perfection. They need presence. Just then Daniel's phone buzzed again. He picked it up, listening for a moment before saying, "I'll call you back." He hung up, then looked at her. "They want me to fire you. Damage control." Nina's eyes flickered. "And what do you want?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I built my whole life on rules and control. You broke both and somehow fixed what no one could." She set the spoon down and wiped Max's chin with a napkin. "You can't fix what's broken by building walls around it. You have to let light in." Daniel didn't answer. He just watched as Max leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her wrist like a thank you too small for words. Later that afternoon, reporters gathered outside the mansion gates. The twin story had turned into a storm. Some called it a miracle, others called it reckless. The front gate was lined with cameras, microphones, and shouting voices. Inside, Nina stayed calm. She closed the curtains, dimmed the lights, and played soft music. "They can feel stress," she told Daniel. "Even at this age. Especially from you." He frowned. "So what do I do? Smile while the media tears me apart?" She looked at him evenly. "You show them who you really are. Not the billionaire. The father." He scoffed softly. "I don't know how to do that anymore." "Then let's start small," she said. "Sit with them. No phone. No plan. Just be." He hesitated, then slowly sat down on the rug beside her. The twins crawled toward him on unsteady hands and knees. Eli tugged at his tie again. Max reached for his watch. Daniel froze, then let out a shaky laugh. "You two really like expensive things, huh?" Nina smiled. "They like what feels alive." For the next hour, the mansion felt like a home for the first time in years. Laughter replaced silence. Tiny hands grabbed his fingers, little feet kicked against his lap. He didn't notice the cameras outside. He didn't care. Something fragile was healing in that room. But peace never stays long in a world that profits from scandal. That evening, his PR manager stormed in with a tablet full of headlines. "Billionaire's nanny under investigation," one said. "Negligence or miracle?" another read. The board was threatening to suspend him as CEO if the controversy continued. Daniel's empire was cracking under the same light that had brought his son's joy. He turned to Nina. "If I keep you here, I lose everything I built. If I let you go, I lose everything that matters." Nina looked down at the twins, now asleep on the blanket between them. "Sometimes you have to lose your crown to find your heart," she said softly. He stared at her, torn between pride and peace, empire and home. "What if I'm not ready to choose?" "Then life will choose for you," she said. At midnight, the phone rang again, his lawyer this time. "Daniel, it's bad. The Child Welfare Office wants to investigate the nanny. They think she endangered the boys. They're coming in the morning." Daniel rubbed his eyes. She saved them. That's not how the world sees it right now. When he hung up, he found Nina sitting by the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "They're coming for you," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "I've seen this before. People fear what doesn't fit their idea of normal." He clenched his fists. "I won't let them take you." She shook her head gently. "Don't fight for me. Fight for them." He didn't sleep that night either. He watched the twins on the baby monitor, dreaming peacefully for the first time. He watched Nina sitting in the nursery, humming under her breath. He made a choice before dawn. When the officials arrived the next morning, the mansion gates opened not for lawyers but for truth. Cameras rolled. Reporters whispered. And standing on the front steps, Daniel Cole faced the world. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, a father holding his son in one arm and resting the other on the shoulder of the woman the world called reckless. "My sons walked yesterday," he began, voice steady, "and they spoke for the first time. Not because of machines or money, but because someone cared enough to break a rule." He paused, looking down at Max and Eli. "If that's a crime, then I'm guilty too," the reporters murmured. Flashes went off. Behind him, Nina stood quietly, her hand on Eli's back. The moment was simple but electric, the kind that rewrites stories. Inside the mansion, unseen by the crowd, a camera light blinked red, still recording everything. The twins laughed softly as if they understood the power their tiny voices had just unleashed. But somewhere beyond the cameras, a black car pulled up near the gate. A man stepped out, suit crisp, expression unreadable. He had papers in his hand and authority in his eyes. And when his voice carried across the courtyard, even the reporters stopped. "Mr. Cole," he called out, "I'm afraid this isn't over." The man with the papers introduced himself as David Lang, an investigator from Child Protective Services. His voice was calm, clipped, official, the kind of tone that didn't bend for emotions. The cameras were still flashing as he spoke, but Daniel gestured for the security guards to close the gates behind him, muting the noise of reporters outside. The heavy metal gates clanged shut, and for a moment the air between them was thick and silent. David adjusted his tie and opened his folder. "Mr. Cole, we received an anonymous report claiming your nanny, Ms. Nina Parker, exposed your sons to dangerous conditions. We're here to assess the situation." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "The only thing she exposed them to was sunlight and love." David didn't react. "We'll determine that. I'll need to interview you, the nanny, and see the children." Nina stood behind him, holding Max on her hip and resting a protective hand on Eli's shoulder. She said softly, "We have nothing to hide." Inside the mansion, everything felt colder again. The sunlight from yesterday seemed to have retreated behind clouds. David sat in the living room across from Daniel, his pen scratching notes on a pad. "Let's start from the beginning," he said. "Your wife passed away during childbirth, correct?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. 18 months ago." David glanced up. "And since then you've been the sole guardian?" "Yes." "You employed multiple nannies?" "5 before Nina." "And the twins' medical diagnosis?" "Developmental delay due to trauma and prematurity. They couldn't walk or talk until yesterday." David's brows lifted. "Yesterday?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "Yesterday. The day Nina did what every doctor failed to do, believed in them." The investigator's eyes moved to Nina, who sat quietly with her hands folded. "Miss Parker, tell me what happened yesterday." Her voice was calm, every word grounded. "I took the boys outside to feel the world. They needed warmth, fresh air, and touch. I stayed with them the whole time. No harm came to them. They stood for the first time and one of them tried to speak." David wrote again. "Did you have permission to take them outside?" "No," she said, honest but unashamed. "But I had reason." Daniel interrupted, his tone sharper now. "She broke my rule, not the law. And that rule was based on fear, not logic." David gave a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole, it's my job to ensure the children's welfare, not debate fear and logic." He closed the folder and said, "I'd like to see the twins." They walked upstairs to the nursery. The twins were sitting on the floor surrounded by soft blocks, their giggles faint but real. Max held a stuffed bear and Eli was tapping 2 wooden rings together. David paused, watching them, his stern face softening slightly. "They look healthy," he said. "They are," Nina replied. "Yesterday was their first real victory." David crouched beside Eli, who looked up curiously. "Hi there," he said gently. Eli blinked, then reached out and touched the edge of his badge, fascinated by the shine. David smiled despite himself. "He's curious." "He's brave," Nina corrected. 4 months they didn't even want to lift their heads. Now they explore everything. After a while David stood, closing his notebook. "I can see they're not neglected," he said carefully. "But there's still the question of your judgment, Mr. Cole. A single incident could have gone wrong. A fall, a scrape, public perception matters." Daniel crossed his arms. "Public perception doesn't raise children. Love does." David sighed. "You may believe that, but the system doesn't run on love. It runs on liability." He turned to Nina. "For now, I'll recommend temporary supervision until this investigation concludes. That means you can stay employed, but everything you do will be monitored." Nina nodded slowly. "I can live with that." But Daniel's fists clenched. This is absurd. David's voice remained calm. It's protocol. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. One more thing, Mr. Cole. Whoever leaked that photo wasn't trying to protect your children. They wanted to damage you. Then he left, the echo of his shoes fading down the marble hall. After he was gone, the room felt heavier. Nina sat back down on the rug beside the twins. You okay? She asked quietly. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. No. But I'll pretend to be until this is over. She gave a small smile. That's parenting in one sentence. The next few days were strange. The house that once felt empty was now full of invisible eyes. Cameras were installed in more rooms under the guise of monitoring compliance. Staff whispered as they passed. The media wouldn't leave the gate. Yet through all the noise, Nina kept her rhythm, singing, humming, reading stories, playing games that made the boys laugh. They began crawling more, babbling, reaching for her hair, her bracelets, her face. Each new sound felt like proof that love was winning, even if the world didn't want to believe it. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual, his tie loose, exhaustion hanging from his shoulders. He stopped at the doorway when he heard the sound of giggles. Inside, Nina was sitting cross-legged on the rug, holding Eli's tiny hands as he tried to balance on wobbly legs. Max crawled toward them, clapping his hands. Up. Eli shouted, his first clear word. Nina froze, her eyes wide, then laughed through tears. Yes, baby. Up. Daniel stepped inside, stunned. He spoke, he whispered. Nina looked up at him, her face glowing. He spoke, Daniel. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside them. Say it again, buddy. Eli smiled and babbled a soft, up. Daniel laughed, a sound full of disbelief and pride. He scooped Eli up into his arms, holding him tight. You did it. You really did it. Max reached for his father too, tugging at his sleeve. For the first time, Daniel sat there, holding both boys close, feeling their hearts beat against his chest. But the next morning, the illusion of peace shattered. The headline on every news channel screamed, "Exclusive, Billionaire's nanny has a criminal past." The article showed a blurry photo of Nina from 5 years earlier, standing outside a courthouse. Daniel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. His assistant rushed in pale. Sir, they're saying she was arrested for assault. Nina stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her face drained of color. That's not what it looks like, she said quietly. Daniel turned to her, his voice trembling. Tell me it's not true. I was never convicted, she said. It was self-defense. I was working as a caregiver for a foster child who was being hurt by her father. I stepped in. I stopped him. He pressed charges. The case was dropped when the girl testified. But the photo, people only see what they want to. Daniel's eyes searched hers, unsure what to believe. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd never hire me if I did, she whispered. And because I didn't want my past to take away their chance at a future. Before he could answer, the front door burst open. David Lang again, this time with 2 officers. Miss Parker, we need to take you in for questioning, he said. The twins started crying instantly, the sudden tension filling the air like smoke. Nina reached for them, but one of the officers blocked her path. Please, she said, tears brimming. They need me calm. Don't scare them. Daniel stepped forward, his voice shaking with authority. You're not taking her like this. Not in front of them. David's tone softened slightly. Mr. Cole, let's handle this quietly. She'll be treated fairly. Nina turned to him, her eyes full of fear and something stronger, resolve. Take care of them, she whispered. They'll need to see your face in their sky. And then, just like that, they let her out. When the door closed, the twins screamed until they could barely breathe. Daniel held them both, his heart pounding. Every cry felt like a mirror breaking inside him. It's okay, he whispered, though it wasn't. The mansion that had just learned laughter now echoed with loss again. That night, Daniel sat in the nursery alone. The twins had cried themselves to sleep. The silence was unbearable. He picked up one of Nina's small notebooks from the shelf, a journal she kept for their progress. Inside were notes in neat handwriting. Day 10. Max followed my voice. Day 12. Eli smiled when Daniel's photo was near. Day 13. They both laughed when I hummed. Healing isn't fast, but it's happening. At the end of the page was a short prayer. Lord, let them see love in his eyes before I leave. Daniel's chest tightened. He realized he had spent more time protecting his image than protecting the people who actually needed him. He closed the notebook and made a decision. The next morning he walked into his board meeting, late, disheveled, holding both twins in his arms. The executives stared, whispering. Gentlemen, he said firmly. "The woman you're calling a criminal gave my sons their first words. She deserves protection, not punishment." One of the men said coldly, "Public opinion disagrees." Daniel slammed his palm on the table. "Then I'll change it." He looked directly into the cameras at the end of the room that streamed live investor meetings. "You all want a miracle story? Here it is. A woman with nothing healed what money couldn't. If that makes her guilty, then none of us deserve the word human." The room went silent. Outside, the story shifted again. Reporters replayed his speech. Hashtags flooded social media. Hashtag stand with Nina. The narrative flipped from scandal to redemption. People demanded her release. By sunset, Nina walked out of the station, free but exhausted. Daniel was waiting by his car with the twins. When she saw them, her breath caught. Max wobbled in Daniel's arms and stretched both hands toward her. Eli clapped. She ran to them, dropping to her knees on the pavement, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My babies," she whispered, kissing their foreheads. Daniel knelt beside her, eyes glistening. "They said your name last night," he murmured. "They said Nina." She covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. "They remembered me?" He nodded. "They didn't forget love." The streetlights flickered on, washing them in gold. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel rich, he felt whole. But as Nina stood up, something in her face shifted. "Daniel," she said quietly, "there's still something you need to know. That man who reported me, it wasn't random." He frowned. "Who was it?" She looked toward the darkened street where a car idled across the road. "Someone who wanted both of us out of your life." Daniel followed Nina's gaze to the idling car across the street and felt that old cold climb his spine, the one that came before boardrooms turned into battlefields. Only this time the field was his front steps and the stakes were two little boys who had just learned what up felt like. The rear door opened with a slow click meant to stretch nerves, and out stepped Gordon Price in a black coat despite the warm evening, Lauren's father, a man who had not spoken to Daniel since the funeral except through lawyers and the kind of letters that carried ice under polite words. Beside him stood a lean attorney with a crisp folder, and behind them, half hidden in the back seat, Daniel caught a shadow he recognized too late. Evan Drake, the board member who had snapped the patio photo, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward a phone like he was waiting for a cue. "Mr. Cole," Gordon said, his voice smooth and loud enough to reach the cameras that still hovered at the gate. "We should talk about what is best for my grandsons," and the way he said "my" made something hard lock under Daniel's ribs. Nina took a half step closer to the twins who were perched on Daniel's hips, their faces turned between the strangers and the warm circle of his shirt like they were reading weather. The attorney cleared his throat and opened the folder with ceremonial care. "Emergency petition," he announced, "alleging neglect, poor judgment, and exposure to risk. Motion for temporary guardianship to the maternal grandfather pending formal hearing," and he held out a paper with a raised seal that made the words feel heavier than they deserved. Daniel's mind split in two. The part that knew statutes and timetables in the favor of judges who golfed with donors, and the part that saw Max's fist on Nina's scarf and Eli's eyes turning wet at the first whiff of a storm. "You waited 18 months to show concern," Daniel said, quiet but sharp. "And you arrived the day they take their first steps. Why? Now?" Gordon's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Because today you proved you are willing to ignore doctors and policies to follow the whims of a caregiver." His gaze slid to Nina like a blade. "And because a competent parent doesn't invite chaos into a fragile life." His words were measured, rehearsed, meant to sound like protection to anyone who didn't know the taste of control. Nina didn't flinch, she kept her voice low and even. "Sir, they need calm, not a fight on the steps." She turned to Daniel. Inside, soft lights, same routine. And that was what they did because babies learn safety from patterns, so they went in together, closed the door, pulled the blinds, and let the world press its face against glass it couldn't cross. In the living room, Daniel set the boys on the rug and crouched so his eyes were level with theirs. "You're okay," he said, and the words felt like bricks under a tent, steadying the thin canvas. Against wind, Nina moved through her rhythm like a song she had practiced since childhood. Lamp on, noise machine low, a stack of cloth blocks that smelled faintly of laundry, the bracelet with tiny bells that made a small happy jingle when she waved hello to wobbly wrists. Still, tension leaks through walls, and the twins felt it. Max's mouth turned down, Eli's shoulders rose, both boys watching faces the way sailors watch clouds. David Lang arrived 3 minutes later because storms call. Officials like lightning calls thunder, and his expression was not unkind but not soft as he took the paper from Gordon and read in tidy silence while the attorney narrated for the record. "Our petition is supported by exhibits. The photograph of the unauthorized outdoor activity, the social services alert, and a sworn statement from an employee alleging repeated violations of safety protocols. Daniel felt the name before he heard it, the shape of betrayal already forming, and then the attorney said it, Claudia Finch, operations chief, the one who loved rules like locks and who had stood on the patio with a tablet glowing and no outside activity. She had filed the statement. Daniel closed his eyes just long enough to see the screw head again, that tiny cruel point on the deck no one had noticed, and a memory slid into place like a piece finally found. 2 weeks earlier, the head housekeeper, Ruth, had handed in a maintenance ticket about a loose fastener on the patio boards, marked urgent, and Claudia had signed it with a red line, defer until after investor event. Appearance priority. Daniel felt heat rise to his neck, not the hot flash of shame but the slow burn of a fuse. Mr. Lang, he said, voice steady because he had trained it for hearings where money and truth didn't always sit together, you should see that ticket and the deferral. If harm was near, it came from neglect higher up, not from a blanket on a sunny day. David's eyes shifted to him, interested despite his role. If such a document exists, we'll need it, he said, and from the doorway a small voice answered, it exists. Everyone turned as Kelly, Daniel's assistant, the quiet one who remembered birthdays and softened hard schedules, stepped in holding a clear folder stuffed with copies. Her cheeks were pink with fury that did not look like rage so much as courage pressed into paper. I pulled the logs last night, she said, work orders, emails, even the internal message. Where Miss Finch says, and I quote, we prioritize optics over noise, Nanny is replaceable. The words fell like stones into a pond and the room went very still. David took the folder, flipped pages with quick, practiced fingers, then glanced at Gordon's attorney. We'll add this to the record, he said, neutral but etched. The attorney tried to pivot. Even if the maintenance was delayed, Mr. Cole permitted a breach of protocol. The children could have been injured. Nina lifted a hand without touching anyone, the way you quiet a classroom with nothing but presence. They were not injured, she said. They found up for the first time, and Eli, as if ordered by a secret drum, patted his knees and whispered, up, like a tiny witness who didn't care about courts. The twins' calm began to return in that circle of bodies that chose soft voices over sharp ones, and Daniel felt a string inside him loosen just enough to let breath travel. Gordon's face tightened, the script slipping, and he made his next move, to history, the kind that hurts more than help. When Lauren was alive, he said, and the room itself seemed to stiffen because saying her name in that tone felt like opening a drawer labeled weapon. She asked me to watch over the boys. She knew Daniel's work could swallow him. He took a folded paper from his coat, old, creased, a letter with Lauren's handwriting, and for a second everything else blurred. Daniel reached for it with fingers that had dug a grave in his mind for 18 months, read the first lines, Dear Dad, if anything ever happens, make sure they always have someone who looks at them really looks, and he had to swallow twice before he could see the rest, and there was not a directive, not a legal grant, but fear in ink, a young mother talking to a father because love makes you imagine every bad thing in the world. Gordon treated it like a will. Daniel held it like a candle. David read it like a document and then shook his head. This is not dispositive, he said. It shows concern, not consent for guardianship. The attorney bristled. Combined with the investigation, and then the house itself interrupted because a child's cry is louder than law. Max's face flushed crimson. He drew in a sharp breath but the exhale snagged, a tiny engine stalled by panic, and the room pitched toward him as Nina slid to the floor in one practiced move. I've got you, buddy, she whispered, tilting him slightly, rubbing 2 firm circles on his back. In, out, follow me, she breathed slow so he could borrow her rhythm, and after 3 beats his chest unlocked and a thin wail turned into a shaky sigh. Daniel felt knees he didn't know could shake go weak. He placed a hand on Eli's back so both boys knew they were held by more than one anchor, and for a minute all the grown-ups watched a miracle that money never pays for. A child borrowing calm. When the air settled, David spoke to nobody and everybody at once. I can't remove them today, he said, eyes on the twins, voice carrying something human. Not on this record, not without a hearing. Supervision stays, monitoring stays, but the children stay too. Gordon inhaled like he had lost an auction at the last second. The attorney clicked his pen shut too hard, the sound sharp and small and petty. The temporary victory felt like a thin bridge over a deep river, but it was a bridge, and Daniel knew you run across before someone decides to burn it. He stood, Kelly full audit of internal messages and maintenance logs sent to Mr. Lang by noon, he said. Security, no one enters this house without my written okay, including Miss Finch unless accompanied by an officer. His voice found the iron it used to find in buildings made of glass, and then he looked at Nina. We build a routine so strong even a storm can't find a seam, she nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting like a coach who sees a team finally believing. For the next hours they built that routine with rope and thread and breath and touch. Morning walk around the inside balcony where sunlight painted squares on the floor and the twins practiced stepping from light to shade. Snack with banana slices placed in a pattern so small hands could learn sequence. A line of 3 books read with the same silly voice every time so sound turned into safety. Nap with the hum set to the exact note that made Eli's eyelids heavy. Play with the bell bracelet and the scarf game where peekaboo was a promise. Daniel put his phone face down and learned that 15 minutes could feel like a door, not a duty, and in those minutes he saw things no report would ever hold. Max's eyelash stuck together from tears he didn't know how to wipe, Eli's habit of tapping twice on the carpet before he crawled, as if asking permission from the ground. Outside, the world argued itself into circles, hashtags rose and fell, op-eds were written by people who had never knelt on a rug, and in a corner office across town, Claudia Finch watched the news and sent messages to Evan Drake. Phase 2, she typed, and he replied with a photo of a sealed envelope ready for a judge who owed a favor. At dusk, the doorbell chimed, a small, polite sound that felt wrong after a day of horns and shouts, and Ruth opened the door to find a girl of about 13 shifting from foot to foot, a thin backpack on one shoulder, her hair pulled back with the care of someone who learned to do it herself. "Is Miss Nina here?" the girl asked, voice brave the way you learn to be brave when no one shows up unless you make them. And when Nina stepped into the hallway her face softened into a shape Daniel had never seen, a mixture of relief and fear and pride. "Jade?" she breathed, and the girl smiled, the kind of smile that fixes a world for 1 second. "I saw the video," Jade said, holding up a borrowed phone. "They're trying to say you hurt kids. I came to say what really happened." And the words fell into the living room like match and light because this was the case 5 years ago that the headlines had chewed and spat without taste. Nina standing between a drunk father and a small foster child, taking a slap and giving back a boundary, waiting with a trembling girl in a courthouse hallway until a judge listened. Jade's presence was not a file, it was a person. David Lang returned just before 8, eyes a little softer, tie a little crooked from a day spent carrying lives on paper. And when he saw Jade, his posture changed from posture to person. "I remember this case," he said, flipping through a tablet and then closing it because screens felt rude next to a living witness. "You were 12, 11, Jade corrected, chin up. "She stayed with me when my aunt was late and taught me how to breathe slow when I thought I would throw up." She looked at Daniel then. "I can say it on camera if they need." And for the first time since morning Daniel laughed, a short, grateful sound that broke into something almost like hope. They recorded a statement in the kitchen under the hum of the old vent fan because some brave things deserve ordinary rooms, Jade speaking. In clear, simple sentences about the night Nina chose a child over her own safety, David asking careful questions, Ruth standing off to the side with a dish towel pressed to her chest like a flag. When Jade finished, she blinked fast and then let 2 tears go because you cannot hold all your water forever. Nina pulled her into a hug that looked like home, the kind you rehearse alone and then give fully when someone shows up at your door. Daniel arranged a ride in a safe place for Jade for the night, promised college funds so lightly it didn't feel like charity, felt the strange weight of joy and duty settle side by side on his shoulders like hands of an old friend. It could have ended there, house quieter, twins asleep, officials less sharp, proof gathered, but stories with real teeth don't rest when you do. At 9:30 the alarm in the security room flashed a silent alert. Rear service entrance opened with a master code used only by 2 people, Daniel and Claudia. The guard checked the camera, saw a slim figure in a dark coat slip through the back hall toward the office where the audits were printing. And when he radioed the living room, Ruth's eyes widened because she knew hallways like she knew recipes and said without thinking, "Backstairs by the pantry." Daniel was moving before the sentence finished. Nina was already scooping Max and Eli into the bassinet on wheels because safety is a muscle you train. David signaled the guard to lock interior doors and down the hall the printer whirred its last page as a gloved hand reached to snatch the stack. Daniel turned the corner at speed and nearly collided with Claudia Finch herself, hair slicked tight, mouth set to the shape of a woman who could cut glass with a word, a thin envelope tucked under her arm. "You can't be here," Daniel said, breath even, hands open at his sides, the way you talk to a cornered animal before you decide if it bites. "You're suspended pending investigation." Claudia didn't blink. "You won't bury me to save a babysitter," she hissed. "I built your walls while you hid behind them," and she lifted the envelope like a torch. Emergency order, signed by Judge Keller, removing the children to the custody of the maternal grandfather effective tonight. The word tonight dragged the room sideways. Daniel stepped forward, calm, literally leaving his body. "On what grounds?" "Imminent risk," she said, savoring the phrase. David arrived at her shoulder, took the envelope, scanned, exhaled a single hard syllable that can be relief or warning. "It's legitimate," he said, then met Daniel's eyes. "But we can contest in the morning. For now it's an order." The house went so quiet you could hear the soft, wet sound of Eli sucking his thumb. Nina stood in the doorway behind them, the bassinet at her hip, Max blinking up at faces he could not read, and she said one word. That sounded like a promise and a plea and a plan all at once. No, not a scream, a vow. The front gate buzzed, the sound of authority arriving, headlights washed the foyer ceiling, shadows moved like long fingers across the floor. Daniel looked at his sons and felt everything he had ever chosen collapse into one choice. He stepped between Claudia and the hallway, voice low and final. "If they leave this house, they do it with me holding them." And Claudia smiled, a small, cruel smile that meant she thought she had already won. The lock on the front door clicked. Footsteps entered. A uniform appeared at the end of the hall. Max's breath hitched. Eli's eyes filled. Nina lifted her hands like you lift a prayer, and from the side entrance a new voice rang out, clear as a bell and strong as a rope thrown across a river. "Hold that order. I have evidence the petitioner committed fraud." And every head turned as Kelly stepped in with a second person at her side. Evan, Drake's personal driver, holding up a phone that showed a time-stamped video of Evan sliding cash and a typed affidavit across a table to a woman with a familiar hard mouth and a tablet on her lap. Claudia Finch. That the video on the driver's phone kept rolling for 10 long seconds that changed everything. Claudia's voice was unmistakable as she leaned forward across the table and said, "You'll get your seat back when Cole goes down. This affidavit says she falsified credentials. Just sign and I'll file it tonight." The driver's trembling hand steadied the phone. Evan's ring caught the light as he slid the envelope across. David Lang didn't wait for permission. He snatched the phone, hit pause, then replayed the clip in front of the uniformed officers. The sound filled the hallway, Claudia's words echoing against the marble. Her face drained of color. The officer nearest her stepped forward automatically. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." She tried to speak, something about misunderstanding, context, but the recording had already spoken for her. Nina stood still, both hands over her heart, whispering, "Thank you, God," over and over as if she couldn't believe it was finally turning. The twins sensed the energy shift. Max began to clap, Eli laughed, small sounds that broke through the tension like sunlight through clouds. Outside, the reporters who had camped at the gate caught the movement. Flashes popped like fireworks as Claudia was led out in cuffs, Evan's name already trending online. The order she tried to use to remove the twins was invalidated on the spot, nullified by fraud. David signed a quick release on his tablet, murmuring, "For the record, the children stay with their father, under no further restriction." Daniel nodded once, but his voice failed him. Relief felt heavier than fear. He knelt beside Nina and the twins, pressing his forehead to Max's small shoulder. "We're safe," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The house that had been a cage of marble now hummed with warmth. Ruth brewed tea, Kelly printed copies of every cleared document, and the twins played on the rug under the soft golden lamps that once watched silence. But peace never comes clean, it always carries the price of truth. Gordon, standing in the corner, his folded petition now worthless, looked older, shoulders drooping, anger cooling into something sadder. "I only wanted to protect them," he said quietly. Daniel rose, tired but clear-eyed. "You tried to protect them from love," he said. "And love is the only thing that ever saved them." Gordon opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking down. "She reminds me of Lauren," he said finally, glancing toward Nina. "Same stubborn heart." Daniel followed his gaze. "That heart is why my sons will have a childhood." Gordon nodded slowly, his eyes glassy. "Then maybe she's the answer my daughter prayed for." By morning, every headline had flipped. The same stations that had doubted Nina now called her the nanny who healed a billionaire's broken family. Hashtags filled with clips of Max taking slow, clumsy steps while Nina's voice encouraged him off-screen. Donations poured into trauma recovery centers in her name. Someone started calling it the miracle of the Marble House. But to Nina, it wasn't a miracle, it was patience, love, and God's timing. She avoided the interviews, spending her days where she felt most at home, on the floor with the twins, singing, laughing, teaching them how to trust the world again. Daniel, meanwhile, faced the board. They wanted to repair his company's image, launch a new campaign to turn the scandal into branding. "We'll call it the Human Project," one executive said brightly. "Family values, second chances." Daniel listened for exactly 1 minute before standing. "You all forgot why I built this company," he said. "Not for headlines, not for power. For legacy, and legacy starts at home." He pushed his resignation letter across the table, shocking everyone. "I'm done being the man who owns everything and knows nothing about his own sons." Before they could protest, he added, "And the woman you tried to destroy? She'll be leading a new foundation under my name. Her work is the future, not your stock value." He walked out before they found words. That evening, he returned to the mansion. His sleeves rolled, no briefcase, no phone, and found Nina on the patio with the twins under the orange sky. The same place where it had all begun. She was showing them how to blow bubbles. Each one floated, caught the light, then burst. "They keep chasing the ones that pop," she laughed. Daniel watched quietly, then said, "They take after me." Nina smiled without turning. "Then maybe you should learn to chase something that stays." He walked closer, kneeling beside them, helping Max dip the wand. "I'm learning," he said softly, "and I'm sorry it took me this long." She met his eyes then, and for the first time he looked completely human. No walls, no armor, just a man who had finally learned to breathe again. Days turned into weeks. The twins grew stronger, their babbles shaping into words. Up became Daddy. Nina became Mama, sometimes, and she always smiled gently, correcting them but never pushing it away. The mansion changed too. Crayon marks appeared on the walls, toy cars under couches, laughter echoing down halls that once held only footsteps. And yet, every time Daniel looked at his sons, he saw not just children learning to walk, but proof that faith and love could resurrect what fear had buried. Months later, the foundation launched quietly, the Lauren Grace Foundation for Child Healing and Emotional Growth. Nina stood on stage beside Daniel, her voice steady as she told the story not as tragedy but as transformation. "You don't fix broken children with silence," she said. "You meet them with patience, you teach them that safety has a face, and that love doesn't leave when the world gets loud." The audience rose to their feet, many crying, some praying. Cameras flashed, but this time they didn't feel invasive, they felt like witnesses to light. After the event, Daniel found her alone backstage, holding the same bracelet with the tiny bells. "You kept it," he said. "It's my reminder," she replied. "Every sound means life still moves." He nodded, reaching into his pocket to pull out something small, a folded note, yellowed and delicate. "I found this in one of Lauren's journals," he said. "She wrote it the week before the twins were born." He handed it to her. The paper read, "If I don't get to raise them, send them someone who knows how to love louder than pain." Nina read it twice, then pressed it to her heart, tears slipping free. Daniel whispered, "She meant you." The story could have ended there, neatly tied, but real healing doesn't stop at one miracle. It becomes a way of living. 6 months later, reporters found Daniel again, this time not at a mansion, but at a children's center the foundation had built in a low-income neighborhood. He was kneeling beside a group of toddlers, reading a picture book while Nina supervised from the doorway. The twins, now walking confidently, toddled around the room helping smaller kids stand. The journalist asked, "Mr. Cole, after all you've lost and gained, what's your biggest lesson?" Daniel looked up, his smile simple and true. "That wealth doesn't measure what you have, it measures what you give." That night, as the sun dipped low and the twins slept side by side, Nina stood at the window watching the city lights shimmer like promises. Daniel joined her quietly, their shoulders brushing. "They're dreaming," she said softly. "About tomorrow." He nodded. "Then we'll make sure tomorrow keeps its promises." She turned to him, eyes warm. "You already have." He looked at her for a long moment, then said what had been sitting on his heart for months. "Thank you for bringing life back into this house." She smiled. "I didn't bring it. It was waiting here all along." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying laughter faint and familiar, the kind that never really leaves, only hides until someone brave enough opens a window. And for the first time since the day he buried his wife, Daniel Cole whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, God, for the second chance I didn't deserve." The camera faded on that image. The man, the woman, the twins asleep under soft light, and the final words on screen read, "Sometimes miracles don't fall from heaven. Sometimes they walk in with a baby on their hip and teach you how to love again." Subscribe to this channel to support our growth.